Linden Place. Also, also present is Joe Valecka, who is our museum administrator. I'd like to take a moment before we go any further to acknowledge the fact that Linden Place sits on 1.8 acres of land that was once part of the ancestral homeland of the Pokanoket, later renamed the Wampanoags. We acknowledge the Pokanoket Nation, whose land and water we benefit from today, who are still here and are honored members of our Rhode Island community. If you're not familiar with Linden Place, this is my 2-minute spiel. I would be remiss if I didn't tell everyone a little bit about Linden Place as an organization. We're a 200-year-old historic house museum in the center of Bristol. We hope that you will at some point come and visit Linden Place in person, take a tour of the mansion, see our property, learn more about Rhode Island and Bristol's truly fascinating and complex history. So please, if you're not able to do so in person, if you are from afar, before too long, we actually will be launching our audio tour where you could actually experience Linden Place from wherever you may be. So be on the lookout for that. I'd also like to invite you, if you enjoy programs of this nature, educational programs, or appreciate historic preservation within Bristol and Rhode Island, to perhaps become a member of Linden Place so that we can do more programs like the one that we're hosting tonight. Tonight's talk will be followed up with questions from our audience. So if you have a question for Bob, please type it into the chat feature of Zoom. Joe, our administrator, will gather those questions and then present them to Bob at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Robert Geake. I call him Bob. Bob is a public historian and the author of 14 books on Rhode Island and New England history. Tonight, Bob will be discussing his book, From Slaves to Soldiers, the First Rhode Island Regiment in the American Revolution. Other books include The New England Mariner Tradition, A History of the Narragansett Tribe, Keepers of the Bay, Native and New Americans, Historic Taverns of Rhode Island, A History of the Providence River, and that's just naming a few. So please look Bob up when you can, and you'll see his full list of publications. Mr. Geake is involved in Smith's Castle, which is another amazing historic house museum in Rhode Island. He's also a tour guide for historic New England's Rhode Island sites. There are several in Rhode Island, and he is also a reenactor with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. So let me present, please, Mr. Robert Geake.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be doing this presentation tonight. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. This is kind of a prequel to the book From Slaves to Soldiers. It explains how the formation of a Black regiment came about in the Continental Line. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the Black Regiment. And if you have any questions, as Susan said, Joe will take them down and he will ask them at the end of the presentation. So this is called In League with Liberty, the Persistence of Patriots of Color and the Formation of the Black Regiment in the Continental Line. I'm not being able to, hold on. There we are, okay. By the winter of 1777, all of New England, it seemed, was encamped with the American Army at Valley Forge. Regiments from Connecticut included the 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 8th, and the 1st and 2nd and 3rd regiments from New Hampshire. 11 regiments were there from Massachusetts, the most represented state, and Varnum's brigade, which included the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments, as well as the 4th and 8th Connecticut regiments under his command. Hailing from Rhode Island, the state which held the largest slave population per capita in New England at the time of the war, Brigadier General James Mitchell Varnum was accustomed to the wagoners, teamsters, cooks, and servants who accompanied the army in its encampment at Valley Forge, as well as to the soldiers of color, who are also widely interspersed among the regiments and generally respected by their fellow soldiers. These early enlistees were almost all exclusively free men, with an occasional enslaved person serving for their master, or a close relative of the master who had been drafted to serve in the war. Such acceptance, however, from the military brass and political parties of the early republic would not come easily. Men of color had been integrated into New England militia since the formation of such companies in the region, and they were included in the adult male populations that were expected to turn out for routine musters and drills for the defense of the towns and villages. Many individuals of color, including African Americans, mulattoes, mustees, and indigenous men, had signed on at the war's outset, enlisting with those local militias that sprang like crocuses during the spring in 1775 in New England. A significant number had taken part in the siege of Boston, the expedition to Quebec, and battles everywhere in the first year of the war. General George Washington had been reportedly alarmed to see so many armed men of color in the regiments that surrounded Cambridge as he arrived to take command of the Continental Army, and for a time resisted allowing more men of color to enlist. As initial enlistments expired at the close of 1775, General Gates had, as voted by the generals and approved by Washington, issued an order that recruiters for the Continental Army not enlist any men of color, whether free or enslaved. Those who had already enlisted were allowed to serve out their terms. Now, this officially dismayed those who had fought beside those Black soldiers in those early engagements. General John Thomas, for one, commander of the troops that were encamped in Roxbury, wrote to John Adams that, quote, "We have some Negroes, but I look at them in general as equally serviceable with other men for fatigue, and in action, many of them have proved themselves brave," end quote. At the same time, Americans were just beginning to read of the service and bravery of our African-American volunteers as newspapers around the colonies reprinted stories of Samuel Lawrence, who roused the citizens of Lexington on horseback as the British approached, Peter Salem's bravery and marksmanship at Bunker Hill, and towns throughout the countryside recognized the contributions of their Black citizens from early in the war. Perhaps of more concern to the Continental officers in Congress were the attempts by the British to raise battalions of Black soldiers. Lord Dunmore's proclamation, issued in November 1775, that offered freedom to any able-bodied enslaved person who could make their way to Virginia, had made the formation of such a regiment possible. And if it were not for the sickness that broke out among the enlistees, it may well have occurred. The widely read Dr. Samuel Hopkins of Newport published a dialogue concerning the slavery of Africans in the wake of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, in which he addresses the fear of many New Englanders who owned slaves and worried that arming those slaves would lead to violence unleashed upon them. New England newspapers, after all, widely printed reports of uprisings in the southern states and the occasional incidents of violence inflicted by an enslaved person against their master or their mistress. The minister in his article warned that, quote, "The only way pointed out to prevent this threatening evil is to set the Blacks at liberty ourselves by some public acts and laws, and then give them proper encouragement to labor or take arms in the defense of the American cause as they shall choose," end quote. With this threat of an Ethiopian regiment, as Dunmore called it, being raised for Great Britain's army, the commander-in-chief became more conciliatory. Writing to Colonel Henry Lee on December 20th, 1775, "We must use the Negroes or run the risk of losing the war. Success will depend on which side can arm the Negroes faster." Still, only free men of color were allowed to enlist. Cognizant that, quote, "The free Negroes who have served in this army are very much dissatisfied in being discarded," I presume to depart from the resolution respecting them, Washington wrote, and have given license for their being enlisted. If this is disproved by Congress, I will put a stop to it, end quote. So the Continental Congress grudgingly approved on the 16th of January, 1776, that the free Negroes who had served faithfully in the army at Cambridge may be reinstated, but no others. Despite the eagerness of African Americans to enroll, Massachusetts and Connecticut initially attempted to curb the enlistment of individuals of color. An act passed by the Massachusetts Assembly in November 1776 exempted Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians from serving in the Continental Line. While little more was done to expand the policy by Congress, in the states, African Americans continued to be taken into local militia who largely patrolled New England's vast coastline. Now, these militia units were of great importance in the defense of the small villages that had grown up along the shores. Militia units within each state, and sometimes from neighboring states, were often called for 3 weeks to 3 months service, performing such patrolling and guard duty, but were also allowed and expected to be embedded at a moment's notice into larger units with the call to arms, and typically were sent on march with 3 days' provisions, no matter their destination. As Congress sent out higher quotas for enlistment, the shortage of troops necessitated the state assemblies to ease some of these restrictions. In January 1777, for instance, the Massachusetts Assembly eased the restriction on African Americans and indigenous people enlisting. So by June 1st, the muster roll of Captain Charles Colton's Second Company of the 3rd Massachusetts Regiment included 11 soldiers of color. In May 1777, a debate in the Connecticut Assembly raised the possibility of recruiting and training a regiment comprised of these patriots of color, but rejected and passed another act that allowed residents to hire Blacks as substitutes for service. This brought an immediate response from slave owners who held within their property numerous slaves, many of whom desired to enlist. However, as conditions in Connecticut did not allow or provide freedom, I should say, in exchange for service, that issue was not addressed until the October session of 1777, when, as an additional inducement to enlistment for making up the quota of the town, if an enslaved person were able-bodied and likely to be able to support themselves at the close of the war, they might enlist to earn their freedom. Their master might secure exemption from the draft and a discharge from future liabilities to which he must otherwise have been subjected. Now, that was an important element of the agreement that would make it a success in Rhode Island, as we'll later see, that people be compensated and they no longer have to be responsible for their slave or servant who had enlisted should they be wounded and returned back home, having to be taken care of in some way. That very summer of 1777 brought news of the daring expedition from a band of Rhode Island militia that successfully took Major General Prescott, the British commander of the forces that occupied Newport and Aquidneck Island, prisoner. That raid, conducted by Lieutenant Colonel William Barton on a farm on the Middletown-Portsmouth border where the Major General was inclined to stay, was made more sensational in the press by the prominent role of an African American in the affair, who reputedly broke down the door of the bedchamber to reach the British officer. Newspapers and journals alike recounted the story. The accounts in the Pennsylvania Evening Post relate much of the details that were printed elsewhere. The troops under Barton had set out from Warwick, Rhode Island, the evening of July 9th, 1777, and rode carefully past the British flotilla by muffling the oars. As the newspaper recounts, quote, they landed about 3/4 of a mile from the house, which they approached cautiously. The colonel went foremost with a stout, active Negro close behind him, and another at a small distance. The rest followed as to be near, but not seen, end quote. After they had entered the house and confronted the landlord, the account says that, quote, on the prospect of present death, the landlord pointed to the general's chamber, which was instantly opened by the Negro's head. The colonel, calling the general by name, told him he was a prisoner, end quote. Now, the newspapers dubbed the Black Patriot Prince, a name that was a common name used by many slave owners, but recent research by historian Christian McBurney, also a Rhode Islander, shows that the Black man was almost certainly Jack Sisson, a volunteer with Captain Thomas Cole's company of Newport. He would later serve 2 years as a wagoner in Captain John S. Dexter's company of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. All of these events conspired to appeal to patriots of color to join the cause of liberty, and for those slave owners to manumit those men who desired to enlist. Washington's further decision to leave the recruitment of Blacks to the discretion of regimental commanders created a fluidity among the soldiers of color that lasted throughout the war. A few, like Pompadour of Connecticut, enlisted in Captain John Ely's regiment on May 26, 1777, and effectively remained on the muster rolls throughout the war. Samuel Bush of Stamford, Connecticut, enlisted on January 1st in Captain Stephen Bett's company of the 2nd Connecticut Regiment and continued to serve at least through 1779. Many others carried their enlistments through the war in different companies and sometimes in neighboring states. Bristol Baker fought in 3 separate Connecticut regiments from 1777 on, ending his military career in Colonel David Humphrey's company of colored troops. Thomas Amos enlisted as a laborer in his native Freetown, Massachusetts early in the war, but later enlisted in Tiverton, Rhode Island, and served in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment after its formation in 1778. James Carpenter shows on the early rolls of Varnum's brigade, but later enlisted in McClellan's regiment of Connecticut State Troops. Another Black regiment, Anthony Flagg, served in regiments both in Swansea, Massachusetts, and in Bristol, Rhode Island. And London Bailey is listed as a servant to an officer on service rolls from Dighton, Massachusetts, but later enlisted in units from Taunton and Eastham as well. To appreciate the effect which this act had can be seen in William C. Nell's original compilation of a list of Black participants with names of over 150 men of color in Connecticut who enlisted in the year of 1777 alone. Rhode Island was also actively recruiting soldiers of color. 2 Black men who rode to British-occupied Newport in July 1777 informed the commander that Blacks were being taken into militias with the promise of pay and freedom. A good number of these early soldiers of color in the Rhode Island regiments and town militias were enslaved men sent on subscription by their masters in place of a son or a close relative. A testimony from a Hessian soldier written the 23rd of October, 1777, confirms that, quote, the Negro can take the field instead of his master, and therefore no regiment is to be seen in which there are not Negroes in abundance, and among them are fine, able-bodied, strong, and brave fellows, end quote. Many of these patriots of color would enter in the New England regiments and become involved in the Philadelphia campaign and then be part of the encampment at Valley Forge. Varnum's brigade, General James Mitchell Varnum, with its 2 Rhode Island regiments and the 4th and 8th Connecticut, were stationed that summer in Peekskill, New York from July, mostly patrolling along the Croton River, and at times having numbers of members dispatched for special expeditions. In August, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment under Colonel Christopher Green was sent on the march to Fort Montgomery on the Hudson River. A large number of the regiment was on garrison duty at Fort Clinton by August 7th under command of Colonel Adam Comstock. Later that month, detachments were taken from Colonel Israel Angel's 2nd Rhode Island Regiment and from the Connecticut Regiment under Colonel Samuel B. Webb to support an expedition under command of Brigadier General Samuel H. Parsons. Now, this was to raid Long Island, but what happened is that as they set out and they crossed the Croton River, as they approached Westchester, they dispersed in different flanks to cover left flank and from Angel and to approach the village of Miles Square. the British attacked the left flank and had some success and pushed back the Americans, and Varnum's brigade was forced to withdraw to the Croton River, and they returned to Peekskill. With the American Army's loss at Brandywine, the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, 1777, the British Army were eventually able to march and take the capital, Philadelphia, of the early Republic. Still, the American Navy and Army controlled the Delaware River south of the city, and the Delaware River Valley, which the Americans now concentrated on protecting to thwart efforts by the British to establish a supply line that would allow a prolonged occupation. So this is a map of Fort Mercer on the Delaware River. And Varnum's brigade received word to join forces along the Delaware River and began the march to Philadelphia on September 29th. The 4 battalions that under his command numbered about 1,600 men and took up a rigorous route from dawn to dusk, averaging 20 miles a day until they reached their destination. On October 7th, Washington gave orders to Varnum to detach Colonel Christopher Green's regiment of some 250 men to defend this fort at Red Bank on the Jersey side of the Delaware River. He was instructed to coordinate defenses with the Navy and the New Jersey militia if needed to protect Fort Mifflin, which was a smaller fort located on a small island mid-river northwest of the Fort Mercer. So after inspecting the breastworks, Greene decided that he needed more troops to defend the fort, and he sent a dispatch to Washington asking that the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment under Colonel Israel Angel be sent to bolster the troops. And he waited anxiously until October 18th when the veteran soldiers of that battalion arrived. The troops quickly took steps to reinforce the inner redoubt of the fort closer to the riverbank, moving artillery into position, building breastworks along the outer fortifications, protected by fascines or brush and timbers. With only a few days on October 21st, 1,200 Hessian soldiers under Count Dunlop had crossed the river from Philadelphia and taken up positions just miles from the fort. The following morning, British warships broke through the river obstructions laid down by New Jersey militia and began shelling the smaller Fort Mifflin. The American guns responded vigorously and kept the ships at bay for several hours, setting 2 of the ships afire when they ran aground attempting to maneuver upriver. And within minutes, the Augusta with her 64 guns and the frigate Merlin were destroyed. Shortly after noon, as Colonel Greene had foreseen, the Hessians launched an attack by land on Fort Mercer, marching through the outer fortifications in 2 columns with little difficulty, only to be shattered by fire coming from within the inner redoubt. As the stunned Hessian troops fell back, the Americans continued the assault with a brisk firing of cannon and musketry, so continuous that those minutes must have seemed an eternity to these young men who, after all, were forced to fight on foreign soil, being subjects of the king's cousin. Over 80 of the Hessian soldiers were killed. Their leader, Count Dunlop, was wounded and captured during the fight. Now, the victorious defense of Fort Mercer has long been attributed to the leadership of Colonel Christopher Greene and his foresight into where they would attack and the strategy that led to victory by letting the enemy wander through hastily thrown up fortifications and letting their guard down until they were hit by the first volley fired at them from a close distance. Other historians, particularly William Cooper Nell, who I mentioned earlier, have quoted an anti-slavery speech in his Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, during which a Missouri speaker spoke of the Rhode Island example in integrating their military. The gallant defense of Red Bank, the speaker declared, in which the Black Regiment bore a part, is proof of their valor. Now, of course, the Black Regiment had not yet been formed, but Black soldiers were there. Among them, as best we can discern, were Francis Baptist, John Daniels, Quash Carr, James Carpenter, Prince Lemus, Pomp Davenport, Henry Hazard, and Prosper Gorton, just to name a few of what is believed to have been more than a dozen patriots of color in that action. And while they do not bear all the glory for victory, what is perhaps more important is the impression they made upon the field officers who would ultimately convince their commander of the worth of adding African Americans to the cause of liberty. Moreover, the assault on Fort Mifflin would continue in the weeks to come after a short lull and last into early November. On the night of the 10th, the British began bombarding the fort from land-based artillery positions. In the next 4 days and nights, the men endured a constant barrage while they sheltered behind the stone wall of a fort that lay along the east side of the island that you see here in that illustration. 2 floating batteries were sent by the British and repulsed, but the following morning, they sent 4 64-gun ships, a 36-gun frigate, and 1 24-gun ship into the main channel southeast of the fort. As you might imagine, the following bombardment put the soldiers there from Rhode Island at increased risk, and at dusk on November 15th, Brigadier General Varnum sent a dispatch to General Washington that said, quote, "We have lost a great many men today. A great many officers were killed or wounded. My fine company of artillery is almost destroyed. We shall be obliged to evacuate this fort this night." The troops marched from the ruins of the fort for a rendezvous with Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene's regiment at Mount Holly, and then crossed the Delaware to join with the main army at White Marsh. These men of Varnum's brigade were soon building the huts for the winter encampment by December 7th at Valley Forge. So by the winter of 1777 then, these men were hardened veterans, both seasoned to the rigors of a sparse encampment, and what is more, they had proven themselves to be capable soldiers in the field. If they were scarcely noticeable to the field officers at Valley Forge, it was because these soldiers of color had by this time become interwoven into the fabric of the American army and become soldiers as much as the white men that they dug trenches beside, that they stood guard with in the freezing cold, and that they slept beside on the cots in the crude cabins at that first winter at Valley Forge. These men included an estimated 15% of the Rhode Island forces that had gathered, as well as a sizable number from Massachusetts and Connecticut regiments. James Mitchell Varnum took residence in the home of David Stevens at Valley Forge, roughly 1.5 miles from Washington's headquarters. The Rhode Island Brigade was encamped some 300 yards beyond the house in the ruins of a star redoubt, which you see on that map. And that star redoubt, even though it was an ancient redoubt, remained one of the strongest works at Valley Forge, and it had a height that commanded the road and river for miles. It was there in that low-ceilinged great room of the stone house that James Mitchell Varnum occupied, where the officers of the Rhode Island regiments, and likely a few guests from neighboring states, gathered and debated the legitimacy of creating a Black regiment to serve in the Continental line. It may well be that these officers felt that this winter encampment with the entirety of the Continental Army now in one community was the last opportunity to enliven them once again and regain that eagerness to earn the reputation and respect of military service that would serve them well in their communities back home. And now the Army sought new recruits to add to these veteran soldiers whose temporary surrender of personal freedom had become a source of communal and personal pride. Richard K. Showman, the editor of General Nathaniel Greene's papers, believes that Colonel Christopher Greene was the prime mover in organizing a Black regiment for the Continental line. The field officer had proved his mettle both at Quebec, then at Fort Mercer, and gained the respect and loyalty of the troops under his command, including those of color. As Rhode Island and other states faced difficulties in fulfilling the new quotas Congress had asked for the Army in the coming year, it's not difficult to imagine how the idea of a regiment of color was resurrected. As the decision was taken among them, Varnum crafted a proposal to General Washington, which he officially dispatched on January 2nd, and reads in part, "Sir, the 2 battalions from the state of Rhode Island being small and there being a necessity of the states furnishing an additional number to make up their proportion in the Continental Army, the field officers have represented to me the propriety of making one temporary battalion from the two, so that one entire corps of officers may repair to Rhode Island in order to receive and prepare the recruits for the field. It is imagined that a battalion of Negroes can be easily raised there. Should that measure be adopted or recruits obtained upon any other principle, the service will be advanced. Varnum laid out the needs of the proposed regiment and asked to send Colonel Christopher Green, Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney, and Major Samuel Ward to clear the state at once, to go to the state at once and begin recruitment of the enslaved men who sought enlistment. Washington approved the measure, and on the same day advanced a letter to Rhode Island's Governor Nicholas Cooke, adding a short note to accompany the letter upon the means which might be adapted for completing the Rhode Island troops to their full proportion in the Continental Army. I desire that you give the officers employed in this business all the assistance in your power. Now, the governor placed the measure before the General Assembly in the February session. Weathering the opposition from the landowners in what was then Kings County, the southern region of the state, which held the largest population of enslaved workers. With Washington's letter expressing his wishes, propelling the assembly to act in his favor, compromise with the plantation owners was reached, if not begrudgingly allowing their enslaved men to enlist. The Assembly's act then reads in part, quote, "It is voted and resolved that every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist in either of the said two battalions to serve during the continuance of the present war with Great Britain. That every slave so enlisting shall be entitled to and receive all the bounties, wages, and encouragements allowed by the Continental Congress to any soldier enlisting into their service. It is further voted and resolved that every slave enlisting shall, upon his passing muster before Colonel Christopher Green, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free, as though he had never been encumbered with any kind of servitude or slavery." Now, such language in this bill, however, would not have been plausible without the additional clauses that mollified the plantation masters. So that this language reads that in case such slave shall by sickness or otherwise be rendered unable to maintain himself, he shall not be chargeable to his master or mistress, but shall be supported at the expense of the state. And whereas slaves have been deemed property by law of their owners, therefore compensation ought to be made for their loss of service. So these key points, that the owners of the slaves who enlisted would be compensated for the loss of their service, and that they would no longer be responsible for their welfare should they return to their estate wounded or with some lifelong infirmary that would give them cause to have to take care of them the remainder of their time. So those were the two key provisions that allowed Rhode Island, rather than Connecticut, to be the first state to put together a regiment of black slaves. So a commission was established with some of the men who had been fighting the act would be on that party to choose the monetary value of each formerly enslaved man. And then the state would pay compensation to the owners when the value of each man had been determined. So despite these obstacles, recruiting had actually begun before the voting of the assembly, with Colonel Christopher Green and Major Samuel Ward dispatched to Rhode Island on the 6th of January. Others soon followed to help with the recruitment. Captain Thomas Arnold left Valley Forge a couple of days later after Green. And just a few days after that, Sergeants Jeremiah Greenman of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment and John Smith of Arnold's company were also dispatched. Brigadier General Nathaniel Green wrote to his brother Christopher of their cousin's mission. The soldiers of the two brigades are now one, and Colonel Green and his officers are coming home to recruit a Negro regiment. Will they succeed or not? Indeed, as Green might have foreseen, the recruitment did meet with some opposition, some of which took the part of violent confrontation. When Captain Elijah Lewis attempted to recruit from the large gathering of men of color who had gathered in South Kingstown, they were harangued by Hazard Potter, who told the would-be enlistees that they would be given the worst duties that the Army could find and would, in effect, be worked to death. Other owners of especially valued enslaved workers sought to persuade them to remain on the plantation with promises of eventual emancipation, or they turned out less valued workers to the recruiters for enlistment. By March of 1778, Colonel Greene had sufficient number to begin training, and Sergeant Greenman would record the occasion of the regiment's arrival in the coastal town of East Greenwich. Training began immediately with daily marching and patrolling along the shoreline between East Greenwich and North Kingstown, Rhode Island. Just a few weeks later, Sergeant Greenman would record in his diary that continuing Greenwich, exercising our recruits. In the part of the day, turned out our black troops, received orders to pick out a guard of 20 men in the sub, and then marched to Quidnesset, where we made a guardhouse out of a dwelling house half a mile from the shore. The following weeks were filled with such deployments, marching and patrolling the great distances along the shoreline. In June of 1778, the Rhode Island Regiment would be called to join General John Sullivan's gathering army perched in Portsmouth to wrest Aquidneck Island and Newport from the British. The regiment would receive recognition for its bravery and resolve in action during the Battle of Rhode Island, which took place on August 29, 1778, in the area which surrounds the site of the present monument to the Black Regiment in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. The formation of the 1st Black Regiment in the Continental Line also had an effect upon those legislators and military leaders facing the rising quotas from Congress for recruitment in other states. Just weeks after General Varnum had dispatched recruiters to Rhode Island, the legislator of Massachusetts received a letter from one Thomas Kench, then serving with Colonel Craft's Massachusetts Regiment of Artillery, stationed on Castle Island in Boston Harbor. So looking ahead to the summer campaigns and the need for more troops, Kench wrote on April 3rd, 1778 that, quote, "A reinforcement can quick be raised of 200 or 300 men. Will your honors grant me and give me command of the party? And what I refer to is Negroes. We have divers of them in our service mixed with white men. But I think it would be more proper to raise a battalion of Negroes." And what Kench had in mind is to have them, rather than have them intermixed with white men, he thought by having a strictly Black regiment, quote, "their ambition would be entirely to outdo the white men in every measure with the fortune of war, that the fortune of war calls a soldier to endure." Now, the Massachusetts legislature declined to form a similar regiment as Rhode Island had done, but rewrote more or less the Rhode Island statute that allowed enslaved men to enlist into regiments populated by both white and Black soldiers. General Nathaniel Greene would come to believe in the success of the Black Regiment, and during his campaign of the command of the Southern Campaign, would strive to convince the South Carolina and Georgia assemblies to raise regiments of slaves for the Continental Army as well. Such legislation cannot fail, Greene wrote to Governor John Martin of Georgia, quote, "if adapted to fix their liberties upon a secure and certain footing." In other words, set them free for their service. The governor responded that, quote, "a body of Blacks, I am sure, would answer every purpose intended, but knew that his constituents would never consent to arming manumitted slaves. It will never go down with the people here," he bluntly informed the general. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment would continue in service and sacrifice during the next few years of the war. In January of 1781, the regiment was merged with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment and was known thereafter as the Rhode Island Regiment for the remainder of the war. Washington had become by this time convinced that integrating Black soldiers into experienced white regiments was preferable than segregating his army. The Rhode Island Regiment's greatest loss came in May 1780, while stationed along the Croton River, when the encampment was taken by surprise at dawn on the morning of the 13th of May by Colonel James Delancey's Loyalist Light Horse Infantry. More than a dozen of the soldiers were killed, including their commander officers, Colonel Christopher Green and Major Ebenezer Flagg. The majority of the dead were Black soldiers. Some 22 others were taken prisoner that morning. The regiment would recover and play an important role in the Battle of Yorktown. At the siege's beginnings, it was Patriots of Color from the Rhode Island Regiment who were digging trenches under fire for the stationing of the Continental Artillery. Their young commander, Stephen Olney, would lead the successful charge on Redoubt Number 10, one of the last defenses of the shattered British line taken on October 14th, 1781. Another heavy loss to the regiment would occur that fall and winter. During a tedious 21-day passage on the Chesapeake, smallpox broke out among the Rhode Island troops. And between November 1781 and March of 1782, some 45 survivors of the attack at Pines Bridge and the Battle of Yorktown would succumb to this disease in the Army's hospital in the city of Philadelphia. And a few times each day, it said, would be buried in the Potter's Field of the city common. And there still is no monument to them there, but there is, in memory of them, a Rhode Island Regiment that is an active reenactment group in Philadelphia. Now, every New England town has stories of such patriots of color. These returning veterans were often lauded in local newspapers after the war and became a kind of living memory of the war as they came to parades and events dressed in their old uniforms. Their stories would become part of the local histories written over generations and thus further interwoven into the full story of the American Revolution. J. Hammond Trumbull, for instance, the Secretary of State in Connecticut during the Civil War, wrote that among his many acquaintances, almost every family has its traditions of the good and faithful service of a Black servant or slave who was killed in battle or served through the war, came home to tell stories of hard fighting and draw his pension. For many of the former slaves who returned to their homes, however, such as they were, life was largely occupied with a hand-to-mouth existence forced upon these veterans by the harsh realities that they had briefly left behind during their service. In my book, From Slaves to Soldiers, I highlight the fact that in death, many of these patriots of color received praise in their obituaries, acknowledging their pride in having served as a soldier of the Revolution. While they lived, many faced having to return as laborers to the great estates that had once held them as enslaved men. As these estates were now largely in decline, they received food, clothing, shoes, and on infrequent occasions, money for their work. Often these were now short-term tasks, such as building walls, removing trunks from a field, building roads, or seasonal work for planting and harvesting. To provide for their families, such men often had to work a variety of jobs at several farms each week. Many of these stories are told in the pension applications that are now available online through both Ancestry.com and Fold3.com, but they reveal other stories as well of those who faced obstacles to obtain even the small pension promised by these men by Congress. One of Hezekiah Babcock's slave named Caesar Babcock enlisted in the local militia in 1775 in his master's stead. He did the same in 1778 when the call came for more recruits. According to his pension application, quote, "In the summer of that year was on the island of Rhode Island, where in the action with the enemy, saw a drummer by the name of Card killed by a shot in the breast while very near him," end quote. Now, Babcock's application testified that he had seen nearly a year and a half of service, well past the 6 months requirement to apply for a pension. But as there was little documentation, his pension request was rejected. In response, 2 fellow soldiers from the regiment wrote to testify that they had served with Caesar. The minister of the Baptist Church of Newport wrote to vouch for the 2 men who had written, writing that he knew that he was aware that statements of Negroes were sometimes regarded with a degree of suspicion, and this was why he was writing to support their claim. Martha Babcock herself, the widow of Hezekiah, wrote that Caesar was a slave to my said husband before the Revolutionary War, and Caesar served as a soldier in the militia for my said husband and went to the Battle of Rhode Island with the army commanded by General Sullivan to act against the British. None of these could dissuade the committee, and he never received a pension or little recognition until his name was included on the monument at Patriots Park. Despite these difficult years after the war, the legacy of service and sacrifice that these Rhode Islanders and other patriots of color from New England brought honor to their brothers who remained shackled to a life of labor. They lifted up the stature of their people in those who thought their minds already enlightened, and fired the first salve wound in demanding that the nation for which they fought included people of color with those citizens whose rights included liberty, justice, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. So I have a couple questions. I have one from Armstead, said, were the Black mulatto soldiers treated differently?
They were not treated differently. They were generally well respected by their fellow soldiers. Occasionally you hear, there's the old argument that was begun by Sidney Ryder, that they were not as brave, and that their actions in the Battle of Rhode Island were sometimes questionable. But later on, after the Battle of Rhode Island, they were sent to Boston Neck in North Kingstown, and were encamped there, much to the chagrin of other slave owners around that area, of course, that section of North Kingstown being the northernmost part of the plantation estates, the Gardners, the Updikes, and all of those were around that area. And while they were there was a mutiny of sorts among the Massachusetts Regiment, and the commander, Sullivan, told them that he had a Black regiment there that would cut their throats if they attempted to leave the premises. And it was a threat that was not taken lightly. So I think that the Black regiment had a rather fierce reputation at the time of the war, immediately after, in the months after that Battle of Rhode Island. And while Sullivan's threat was certainly a little over the top, I think it shows that men had heard of the Black regiment. And so that was a useful tool for Sullivan to keep them in line, a threat of a Black regiment bringing discipline upon them.
All right, and Cliff would like to know, are there any other memorials to the Black soldiers in Rhode Island besides Portsmouth?
They are, that is the only one that I'm aware of in Rhode Island. In my last book about the New England plantations, the last chapter talks a little bit about the slaves, the former enslaved men who are buried in different locations in Rhode Island. And but there were others who were never recognized until that monument was created in Portsmouth. So that's really the only one that I'm aware of.
All right. And then Lynn would like to know, how successful were the British in recruiting the enslaved, and when they lost the war, what happened to those men?
They were very successful in recruiting the enslaved men. As much as we tout the men of New England who served in the New England regiments, outside of New England, many Blacks decided that they would take the opportunity to make their way to Virginia and to Florida and to enlist with the British Army. Unfortunately, they were not treated particularly well when they got into the British Army. The ones that ended up at Yorktown suffered smallpox, and before the battles of Yorktown, they literally let them loose, and they were running among the Americans. The Americans were finding them in the woods as they approached Yorktown, suffering terribly because they had were sick and they had just been let loose into the woods because the British did not want any more infection in the city. And as far as the ones who were sent to New York, those who had gone to New York, where the British held for so long, they were made into a regiment, but that was a regiment that was largely used to patrol the streets of New York. They did not see any battles, take place in any battles. And as for leaving the city, those that left the city, the majority did not go back to England, as they may have thought. They were sent to Nova Scotia and Halifax. And that's where many communities of color began, from those people who were sent after the Revolutionary War to Halifax, Nova Scotia.
All right, and Stephen would like to know how many of the soldiers named on the Portsmouth Monument survived the entire war?
That I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that question. Yeah, I would have to do some research to find out how many of those that actually survived. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that.
Oh, okay. All right, and then Lynn would like, can you share the story of Simeon Simons, who was a Pokanoket and a descendant of Massasoit?
I've heard the name, but I'm afraid I don't have that story.
Someone points out that there are 721 names on the Portsmouth Monument.
Yes.
And then he was a bodyguard to General Washington, Simeon Simons.
I've heard that. I think that, so there was a special unit who were George Washington's personal bodyguards. And that's where I've heard that name, that he was part of that unit. But I don't know the full story of that.
All right. Any more questions or?
I can tell you that it's estimated that some 5,000 Black men served in some capacity during the Revolutionary War. And that could mean anywhere from 6 months service to the full 8 years.
Ryan would like to know, did you share the story of Windsor Fry?
Yes. Windsor Fry is in the book on the First Rhode Island Regiment. He, of course, has a rather interesting history. He was actually convicted of robbing general stores for the Army, and was scheduled to be hung for that crime. Washington pardoned him, and thereafter he was apparently a very good soldier after that. But his family spent many years trying to get recognition for his service, and they did some years ago, just a few years ago, really, and become part of the DAR listings. And so, yeah, he has a very interesting history. And I've also heard that he was part indigenous, but that being part of the census taking later on after the war, he's listed as a Black man and thereafter remained a Black man in the census, even though on military records, the first incident of him enlisting describes him as an indigenous man.
Rob would like to know, where was the North Kingston encampment you referred to, and when did the soldiers depart?
It was right around Casey Farm, where Casey Farm is located. And so they had a nice lookout there, as you probably know, if anybody that's been to Casey Farm, right across the street is a nice overlook of the passage. And so they had a good spot to see the British approaching if they came there. There's even actually, if you go to visit Casey Farm, I'll just tout historic New England for a moment. If you go to visit Casey Farm, there's actually a bullet hole in one of the doors there from a skirmish that occurred there when the British raided the encampment.
Armstead would like to know how many descendants are still in the area today.
I don't know of
If you
a
know.
great many descendants still in the area today. I hear occasionally from people who are descendants of the First Rhode Island Regiment and of other descendants of other Black people who served in the Revolution. But I don't know specifically how many descendants are still around Rhode Island today.
Ryan points out that your work helped him learn so much about Fry, Cuff, Torrey, and Prince Anthony, and he's a direct descendant of all three.
That's wonderful to hear.
And he says there's a few in my family, so probably a dozen or two minimum.
Sure. You know, for every story that we tell about a soldier of the Revolution, there are many that are not told because you can't prove all of the facts that are needed to say, yes, this person was a soldier of the Revolution. So I have no doubt that there are many stories that still lie hidden. You know, people that, you know, ran away, enlisted, you know, were a soldier for 6 months and never, you know, and then ran away again. Or, you know, there are other incidents of people joining and never really getting on the muster rolls, but they were there as testimony has attributed to them. So going through the pension records, as I have the last number of years, has really been an enlightening experience. And you can see there, those who did and did not receive pensions, and all of their stories are told in their own words, which is fascinating to me.
All right, I think that should do it. So thank you so
Okay.
much, Bob.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you everyone for taking time out of your evening to join us. Thank you so much, Bob. That was really just so informative, a lot of information to soak in. So once again, if anyone feels like they would like to rewatch, or if you feel like you might have missed the first few minutes, this was recorded. So hopefully we'll make that available in the next day or two. We do at Linden Place actually have an in-person sort of coffee and conversation talk with DeWolf Fulton, a family descendant, on the travels of Norwest John. That's taking place next Friday, March 4th. That's actually in person at Linden Place. It's Friday morning at 10 o'clock. If you would like information on that or any other upcoming events at Linden Place, visit our website, lindenplace.org, and you know, reach out to us and let us know what you'd like to learn more about. We're always wanting to find out what our audiences are interested in and what you would like to learn more on. And thanks again to Bob for his time and for his thorough research. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.
Well, also, thank you.